This is the video that you've all been waiting for, or at least what I've been waiting for. This has become a yearly tradition on the channel, and we're here for the 2024 edition of ranking every game that I played this year. Before we dive in, I'd just like to lay down my ground rules. I'll have a score for each game in the top left out of 10, and in the top right I will have the game's average score on Backlogged.com. Previously this was the Metacritic score, but I kinda realized that Metacritic is not the greatest site of all time for game quality, so we changed it. With that being said, let's get into it with number 30. My least favorite game I played this year is The Wolf Among Us. Similarly to The Walking Dead, this is another Telltale game, and in my opinion at least, it's not nearly as good of quality. The Walking Dead Telltale is one of the most emotionally potent games, period, and Wolf Among Us is more of a joke than anything. For what it's worth, I did play this on the Vita, but it runs poorly, the characters look terrible, the story is boring, the voice acting is horrible, it really is a full complement of a bad game. The entire thing just boils down to choosing whether or not to be the big bad wolf. There are no real actual moral decisions that you'd really have to think about, but considering how it's a story-based game where it's something where your choices affect the outcome, and that's kind of the whole point of it, but the choices are so black and white that it's pointless. It's nothing more than an easy platinum trophy for me, and that's why it's the worst game that I played this year with a good old 1 out of 10. If any OGs of the channel remember the ranking every game I have played video from a couple years back, thank you. You may also remember that a certain series dominated the bottom of the list, and that was the Dark Pictures anthology. Well, I think you can see where this is going. This time I played it with a group of friends, and it was still boring. This is another interactive story game like Wolf Among Us, but it follows a woman getting brutalized during a war with Salim and Kareem. Look at these captures from my own playthrough. Yes, I'm finally using my own footage. Are you guys proud? This image right here is a goated image. So House of Ashes does not deserve last place for this alone.
Oh, no!
The final bad game that I played this year was Spider-Man Web of Shadows. Web of Shadows clearly had a ton of ambition and some really cool ideas which ultimately went wasted on a bad game. The mission structure is repetitive and boring. It's just beating on the same few enemies in the streets for the entire 8 hours. It feels awful to play and makes the already boring missions frustrating as well. The ability to be a hero or a villain is actually fairly well done, and it allows for some scenes that the goons back home will definitely appreciate. I would imagine that if this had the gameplay of the Insomniac games, it would definitely warrant multiple playthroughs to see both paths. It also takes full advantage of the Spider-Man license and pulls so many different characters to create a pretty cool story, actually. If Insomniac had this much ambition for their game's narratives with the different choices you can make and all the different characters that get looped in, they could really create something special. Web of Shadows is one of the most ambitious games out of that entire era, but if you want to see a lack of ambition, take a look at Persona 5 Toilet. Sorry, I meant Persona 5 Tactica. Tactica is a tactical RPG visual novel in the Persona 5 universe. It features a chibi art style which looks pretty bad in my opinion and also doesn't really work well with the Persona 5 image. All the other Persona 5 games look really cool and flashy, which is hard to pull off with these goofy looking character models. The story is told through a visual novel format and surprisingly little of it is voice acted. It really makes me think that this game's budget was like $15 or something. The visual novel format and the lack of voice acting really hurt my immersion with the story and it made it kind of boring for me, and I never really got invested in it at all. For me at least, it's jarring how much worse this is compared to every other game in the Persona 5 universe. With all that being said, the combat is still very, very fun, and the music is also very good. Next up, we have a game that is part of the elite Backlogged core. These are games that turbo virgins love, like myself. With that being said, I sadly did not like Ghost Trick Phantom Detective very much at all. It provides a great mystery with a very stupid ending. This game's puzzle structure, just to add context, involves watching a crime scene play out and freezing time at a certain moment to interfere with what's happening to stop the crime. My main issue, however, is that I did not like the puzzles at all. They're very tedious. One example being switching between ghost and real-time forms takes a second or two each time, and you constantly do that for the entire game, so it gets really, really annoying. Another big issue that I have with this game's puzzle structures is that the entire thing is based upon having your moment to strike, your moment to stop that crime from happening, and sometimes if you miss it, then you have to rewatch the entire thing all the way back to that moment, and imagine if you miss the timing a second time. Oh, it's so annoying. But number 25 is also part of the Backlogged core. There will be 2 different reactions to this next game from the audience. Nothing in between. Some of you will be saying, "What the fuck is this?" And then the rest of you will be saying, "Oh hell nah." We have the house in Fata Morgana next. This game is a visual novel, meaning there's no real gameplay to speak of. It's a fantasy-ish tale with some time travel plot points. It's very hard to explain. It's a very artistically inclined game, with a large focus on its soundtrack and portraits. I thought the pacing of the story as well was very poor, with hours of semantic dialogue and no breaks. But when this game cooks, it cooks. It actually made me cry a couple times. It could have been 20 hours instead of 40 though, that's about it. Oh boy, some people are gonna be mad I have this over Fata Morgana. Next is Toy Story 3.
Oh my god, bro. Oh, hell no, man. What the fuck, man?
As a youngster, I loved the Toy Story movies, so I always had a soft spot for the franchise. For years, I have been made aware that there's actually a decent enough 3D platformer based on Toy Story 3 on the Xbox 360 of all consoles. So when I finally found a copy for $1, I decided to give it a shot, and it was very okay. It plays like any mid 3D platformer from the PS2 era with some cool Toy Story flair. And now we finally made it to our first positive score with Sly Cooper 1. From time to time, I get the itch to grind some platinum trophies, and when I got my platinum for Spider-Man 2, oh spoilers, that's coming later, I got the itch for some platinum. In that phase, I got the first Sly Cooper's platinum on my Vita. This was my first ever written review, so bear with me here, because all these segments are based off of my written reviews at the time I played them. So I wrote, it has some very fun moments while also being incredibly frustrating at points. I never played any PS2 platformers when I was younger, so perhaps I was not ready to take on Sly Cooper just yet. What, was I trying to get Sly Cooper's Number 22 is The Walking Dead's final season. This series is the video game equivalent to a book that makes you just want to keep turning the pages. It has an incredible ability to keep the player engaged in the plot, unlike Wolf Among Us. The final season specifically has a couple aspects to which I find really neat. The idea that what you teach AJ, who's basically Clementine's little brother, reflects in his character, I find that very interesting, and I haven't seen it implemented elsewhere. The game's high-tension moments are incredible, as you would expect out of the series, but sadly, the side characters generally suck, and the choices that you make don't impact the ending nearly as much as they should, considering that this is the finale. Alright, number 21. Oh shit, I'm gonna get cooked again. Next is Zelda Ocarina of Time 3D. Now trust me, I do like Zelda, but just so happens that I like every other 3D Zelda more than this one. I will say one thing, Majora's Mask mogs this one, it's so much better. Just barely edging out Zelda Ocarina of Time is Persona 5 Dancing. Did you guys know I like Persona at all? Now what Dancing brings to the table is some funny dialogue with my favorite Persona cast and some nifty tunes. This was another one that I played just to get the Platinum Trophy, and I liked it more than Ocarina of Time, who would have thought? Number 19 is Sonic Rush, my first Sonic game that I ever beat. It's a mixture between a typical Sonic game and a boss gauntlet. Now this is a kind of a side note, I don't have this in the script, but I just want to say it. Oh me oh my. When I mentioned boss gauntlet, it reminded me of a game that I played after writing this script, Kirby Superstar Ultra. I expect to see it in next year's video. That game is top 15 game I've ever played, 10 out of 10, it would be number 2 on this list. But next year, you're probably going to see a couple more Sonic games along with Kirby Superstar Ultra on the list, so stay tuned, because I like Sonic Rush to want to get more Sonic games in next year. 2024 was the year of the remake. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, Persona 3, Paper Mario The Thousand Year Door, and Silent Hill 2. This spot's for the original, though. The remake is going to join all the Sonic games in Kirby in next year's list. Look out for that one. Silent Hill 2 is not only part of the Backlogged core group, but it is also an extremely artistically inclined game. One where every little design choice is either extremely calculated or overanalyzed by fans. It is probably the second most thought-provoking game I've ever played, and its narrative is extremely powerful. Too bad the gameplay sucks dick. On last year's list, I was too much of a to hate on God of War 2018 in my video, giving it a high rating because I felt like I should. Well, I'm revoking that 8 out of 10. God of War 2018, 4 out of 10, fuck you all. But this spot is for God of War 3, which is actually good. It has some really cool scenes in it, and each one made me keep playing to see the next. It's very short and not profound whatsoever, but I think it suits it very well. I enjoyed this much more than 2018. Next is Shovel Knight, which is a pretty darn good 2D platformer. It has a ton of charm and it looks great. Nearly all the levels are decently fun. The boss fights, however, are where the game really shines. It can be frustrating, especially with the knockback after being hit. You'll constantly be getting knocked into pits like Ninja Gaiden. That's very frustrating. Despite that, though, the game provides a fun challenge and is overall very good. Now imagine where Hollow Knight would be if I actually played it. Expect that on next year's list. This year, a goal of mine was to play one of every major JRPG franchise that I had yet to play. One of those, of course, was Final Fantasy. There were 3 candidates that I was kind of picking between: Final Fantasy VII Remake, the original Final Fantasy VII, and Final Fantasy X. Eventually, I decided to play Final Fantasy VII Remake, mainly because I wanted to play Rebirth. About 10 hours or so into my playthrough, this game was on its way to an elusive 10 out of 10 for me. Sadly, my wisdom tooth removal took me out of the game for 2 weeks. I know you'd probably expect it to be the opposite, but after that, it was never the same. All in all, the first half of the game was probably a 10 out of 10 for me. Post wisdom tooth, it was a 5. I'll call it an overall 7, which is pretty solid still. I think another thing that made me like the second half a lot less was that it deviates from the original story in favor of doing some confusing multiverse plot. I don't want to sound like an old head when I'm saying that the remake should follow the original's plot verbatim, but I just kind of find the originals more interesting, I guess. You know how I had a visual novel earlier? Well, this is a real visual novel, with fun, detective-based gameplay. Danganronpa 3 might just have the worst ending I've ever seen in my life, but I enjoyed the road quite a bit. It'd be like going game hunting, and the experience itself was very fun, but you end up getting nothing the entire day. I think 3 has better characters than the previous 2, actually. Every character that lived past the 3rd trial in this game I actually liked quite a bit. Danganronpa 3 starts out extremely slow, but it picks up at the end, and I liked it quite a bit. Our first 8 out of 10 is Donkey Kong Country 2. This is probably the hardest game I've ever beat. I don't know if I should be proud of that or not. As you'd expect from a Nintendo-made SNES game, it looks great and has a great OST, and most of the levels are really fun, but there's those couple stinkers in there. The saving situation in this game is also very annoying, as is kind of standard for a Donkey Kong Country SNES game. It makes you replay the same levels over and over and over again, and it's very fucking annoying. But that's sometimes a good thing, because the levels are very fun, so I mean, is it really that bad? Next up is Astro's Playroom. Don't worry, Astrobot's coming later. Astro's Playroom is one of the very few games to show the potential of the DualSense controller. You really feel everything in this game. You can even make your controller feel like a zipper. It looks great, it's a super fun platinum, it's short, but I don't want to get too ahead of myself on the Astro glaze. You'll get more later, trust me. The Last of Us 2 is a great example of being a victim of the internet hive mind. One of the best stories ever told in a game. The final flashback scene of Joel before the credits rolled brought me to tears. The Last of Us 1 is one of the greatest games ever made, and it's still slightly better than 2 for the sole reason that I think the shorter runtime works better for the sometimes boring gameplay. Specifically, the first 2 days as Abby drags so much, but I love the game regardless. One of the best the PS4 has to offer, and also the most thought-provoking story I've ever seen in my life. I mean, I watched countless YouTube documentaries analyzing this game's plot after finishing it for like weeks on end, actually. We have finally reached the top 10, so from here on out, not only are these some of my favorite games I played this year, but some of my favorites ever. Here's Spider-Man 2. I'm sure you guys were waiting for it, right? I got this game for Christmas last year, as I'm sure many of you guys did too, and I technically played it in 2023, but we can let it slide here. The Spider-Man Insomniac games are just plain fun. You're never going to get anything overly artistic or profound out of them, but you will get a fun playthrough and some of the best platinum trophies in the business. As a Serum in the Flesh faithful, he glazes some mid games from time to time.
It's one of the best games of all time.
But Contra is not one of them. Contra is now my favorite NES game. First things first, why do people say this game is so hard? Similarly to Celeste, I don't think this game earns its extreme difficulty reputation, if you use cheat codes that is, which I feel like everyone does. Regardless, it's a surprisingly well-designed game. The controls are tight, and it has that NES feel without being bullshit, which is just as good as a compliment as you can give an NES game. The Last of Us Part 1 was once a game that I considered to be the greatest of all time. With its powerful and emotional narrative that resonates well with damn near everyone on this planet, and fantastic performances from Kanji Tatsumi and Ellie. Now, where The Last of Us falters for me is that the game as a whole is more narrative reliant than I originally thought. What I mean by that is that during my first blind playthrough, I thought the game was the greatest thing ever, while on my non-blind playthrough, I thought the gameplay was a bit more mid, mainly because it probably wasn't as exciting to get to the next story beat. Now, those astute of you may realize that this is the only game I've specifically mentioned replaying on the list this far. I included it because it was my first time playing the 2022 remake. If I included any replays on my lists, then the number 1 spot would look a little like this. And my number 1 spot, the best game I played in 2027, is Super Mario 64 for the 4th year in a row. Now, my biggest fans, if I even have any, who are very familiar with my game taste may be surprised that this next one isn't higher. Metaphor Fantasio is in some way Atlus's magnum opus, taking everything they learned from SMT and Persona and creating something special. And special it is. However, I feel like this game, surprisingly enough, was not directed at me. I have a history of not liking games with typical fantasy-ish settings. Skyrim, Chrono Trigger, Dragon Quest, to name a few. The game is packed with flair, so much style, albeit not my favorite from Atlus, which is kind of an impossible benchmark to reach. The combat system is absolutely phenomenal, and as is the archetypes, which is basically the alternative to Personas and how you build your party members. It allows for so much freedom as to how you want to build your party. For fuck's sake, I spent north of 10 hours at the end of the game grinding to maximize the potential of each party member. And it also helps in not having the typical Persona special at the end of the game where you build some diabolical physical attacking persona that one-shots every fucking enemy in the game. As for the story, it's so predictable that it's kind of upsetting to me, although it's still not bad. I knew exactly what was going to happen at every twist and turn in this game, maybe except for one. Forgive me for giving Metaphor so much more time than everything else so far. Not only was it the most recent game I finished at the time of writing the script, but it's also one that I've yet to talk about on the channel whatsoever, so I was kind of getting a little passionate there. I don't know if the Resident Evil series is for me. On one hand, the puzzles in the Resident Evil 2 make were so horrendous that I stopped playing after 2 hours, but 4's remake is one of the greatest games I've ever played in my life. The game feels silky smooth and is absolutely stunning. The main gameplay loop, as opposed to being the shittiest puzzles of all time like in Resident Evil 2, is the greatest shooting gallery third-person shooter I've ever played. Resident Evil 4 Remake avoids all the pitfalls that the games in this type of genre always fall into. It's arcadey, has tons of weapon variety, so many good bosses. There's a certain magic to being low on ammo and barely being able to fight through another horde of zombies and coming out on top. Or having no ammo for any gun except for one that you've barely used at all, and then you use that gun only to find out that it's absolutely cracked. The story suits the game perfectly as well. It's just the right mix of goofy and serious, and it kept me invested the whole way through. Alright, now, the top 5. Guys, please don't make fun of me. Catherine Full Body puts up the facade of being a game when it's actually a puzzle game. Yeah, of course I played Catherine for the puzzles. What else would I play it for? On a real note, Catherine brings all the personality and flair that you will get out of a Persona game, and instead of being packed into 100 hours, it's like 10 to 12. The story presented is quite funny, and it even pulls a Persona and shits itself in the final leg. All in all, a very solid time, and a great introduction to Atlus games, given it's much shorter than everything else they have ever put out. Mother 3. The plot is amazing, one of the best endings ever, made me and plenty of others get really emotional. The combat is very fun, with the rhythm combos and rolling health bar, it adds a lot. The music is great too, you've probably been listening to it a lot throughout the entire video. It's hands down the funniest game that I've ever played, and it got me laughing quite a few times throughout. It's very creative in every way, the locations, the plot, the enemies, they're all so creative. Sadly, it's not perfect to me. The characters themselves get no time to really show their personality. Flint is who I think is the best character, and he's present for like maybe an hour or two of the game. Boney and Duster also suck dick in battle. You only get 4 party members in the entire game, and it just so happens that 2 of them are pretty much incapable of fighting any bosses. Like, I've never seen a more polarized party in terms of combat unless you intentionally use a shitty Pokemon team. With that being said, hashtag bring Mother 3 to the US for last burger. Fallout New Vegas is one of the biggest what-ifs for me in gaming. Imagine how good it could have been if it wasn't so glitchy with such weak graphics and such janky gunplay. Western RPGs in general just have never clicked for me. I didn't like Mass Effect or Skyrim when trying them, but despite that, I gave New Vegas a shot, and my expectations were completely blown away. More than any other game I've ever played, it feels like this is my story and I'm controlling everything that happens in it. Any choice that you make in this game has some sort of impact on something else, which impacts something else, and it's just so intricately designed, and I can't even imagine how they made this game in such a short development time. Absolutely brilliant writing and storytelling, and now this is taking the #1 spot for a game that I want to be remade with modernized graphics and gunplay. Imagine how good it could be, because New Vegas has limitless potential. Number 2 is Astrobot. Astrobot was the first time ever in my life that I bought a game on launch pretty much just because of how well it got reviewed by fans and critics alike, and I was not let down. Astrobot is pretty much as close as we're going to get to Mario Galaxy 3. All of the power-ups you get truly bring that Galaxy vibe to them. The game controls great, it looks great, it's an absolute blast to play through and to platinum. The fact that my biggest complaint about the game is that Joker is not playable shows how damn good it is. Did you guys know I like Persona? Well, if you didn't, then here you go. Persona 3 Reload was a remake that absolutely needed to happen. The original from 2006 had all the bones of being a fantastic game, but it had some fatal flaws that needed to be remedied. Some of those flaws were fixed the next year in Persona 3 FES, which also added extra content, but the game still wasn't perfect and had some issues. And, speaking of, a lot of those issues were fixed 2 years later with Persona 3 Portable. Portable fixed a lot of the issues that the PS2 versions had, while also adding even more content on top of it. But Portable added another flaw itself. The game was told in a complete visual novel format. It also removed some of the extra content that was added in FES. Now at this point, we're in 2009, and there are 3 versions of Persona 3, and none of them are definitive. Fans debated over which was the best version of Persona 3 for nearly 15 years, until Persona 3 Reload was announced. Reload, of course, retains the fan-favorite story of Persona 3, while also giving it modernized gameplay and graphics that are similar enough to Persona 5. It remedies nearly all of the problems fans had with the originals and creates one of the greatest JRPGs of all time. Persona 3 has the most profound story of the modern Persona trilogy, with it covering death and different ways to deal with grief. Nearly every character, both side and main characters, provide a different glimpse of what it's like to deal with grief for different people. This results in one of the most powerful narratives that you'll ever get in a game. Also, as you would expect from an Atlas title, the art is top tier. Between the striking style the game presents and the music that you will listen to outside of the game, and in this video, the art in this game is top tier. It may not be my personal favorite Persona game, that's of course 5, but it is without a doubt the best game that I played this year, the only 10 out of 10, and one of the greatest games of all time. Well, what do you guys think? Overall, this year's worth of gaming was weaker than last year's, which I guess is to be expected considering I had like 4 games that I gave a 10 last year. I did, however, play some fantastic games this year, as well as some after this script. And if you'd like to see my scores and reviews for those games, as well as any that I am going to play in the future, follow me on Backlogged.com @Sersumi. That's where I have all of my reviews and ratings for every game that I've ever played on. You could, of course, just wait for next year's video if you don't want to do that, though. With that being said, make sure to like and subscribe if you guys enjoyed. More videos like this will be coming soon, and you won't want to miss them. I would also like to hit 1,000 subscribers by the end of 2025. Thank you guys so much for watching, and have a Gus.